Welcome to the High. My name's Erin Doherty. I'm head of public programs and community engagement here at the museum. Thanks for joining us for tonight's talk. Before we begin, I want to extend a special thank you to all of our members who are here. Your support is invaluable. Tonight, we are excited to explore an outline of the history of picture books and their connection to childhood, all of this through the context of Maira Kalman and the High's current exhibition, The Pursuit of Everything, Maira Kalman's Books for Children. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's esteemed guest, Dr. Paige Gray. Dr. Gray is a professor of liberal arts at the Atlanta campus of the Savannah College of Art and Design. She's held visiting assistant professor positions at Fort Lewis College and the United States Military Academy at West Point. She received a BA in English from Indiana University, an MA in journalism from Columbia College in Chicago, and an MA and PhD in English from the University of Southern Mississippi. Dr. Gray is the author of the newly hot off the presses released book Cub Reporters, American Children's Literature and Journalism in the Golden Age. And also don't forget, immediately following tonight's talk, you can have a chance to check out the exhibition. We can direct you where it is. The galleries will be open till 9 p.m. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Paige Gray.
Hello. Welcome. How are we doing? Good. Well, I'm going to touch briefly on a lot of material here. I'm going to kind of zoom through the history of childhood, children's literature, and picture books. But we should have plenty of time for questions. So, I hope this to be interactive and a participatory discussion here. So please feel free to, either hold your questions for the end, or if it's, you're dying to say something or ask a question, I don't mind if you jump in. It's fine. But let's go ahead and get started. I just want to ask you, you're all here, so you have some kind of interest in picture books. Or you know what they are, right? What are some of your favorite picture books? Curious George, I know that one. What? Madeline, you know Madeline in two straight little lines, right? And I might talk about that one a little bit. If you give a mouse a cookie, I've taught that one too. And some people will say it's about Reagan economics even, right? And we're going to talk about that. How can there be politics in children's literature? Well, here's another question. This might sound simple, but it's tricky. What is a picture book? A book with pictures? Okay. What else? I'm not saying anything. Any other ideas or definitions? Okay, hold on to all these things. Connected to this idea of what is a children's book, why do we associate it with childhood? When I say picture book, I'm sure most of you think kids. Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's just, the basic barrier of literacy, right? Most young kids don't come out of the womb knowing how to read. So we're kind of introducing them to language. So that, form of language acquisition. Right. Yes. You're welcome. To understand the meanings of visual and verbal language in picture books, we need to understand how culture thinks about childhood. And of course, I have Maira Kalman's work illustrating my own work here. Childhood, children's literature, picture books. You can't analyze that. I hear variations of this all the time from people outside academia and a lot of times from people within academia. They think children and their culture are innocuous, innocent, insipid, or inane. I can't tell you how many times I've gone someplace new, whether it be me, I'm on a new academic position appointment or at a conference, and I say, oh, what do you specialize in? Because within literature, we all have our specializations. I say children's literature. I get the look. Well, it's a dumbed down version of the literature I analyze. So even within the academy, or maybe particularly within the academy, you get this. Since you're all here tonight, I assume you all have a passing interest in childhood or children's literature or art. And I hope to further convince you of the validity of the study of children's literature and culture as an area of inquiry. But I'm much more interested in reminding you that childhood, as we understand it in the popular imagination, resides within all adults, and adulthood resides within all children. Many iconic cultural moments come from children's literature, books, and film. I'll see here. Think about Alice chasing the white rabbit into Wonderland, or Dorothy opening the door of her dislodged home to see the technicolor beauty of Oz. These moments help shape not only our cultural consciousness, but also our individual identities and understanding of the world. By critically analyzing children's literature, and picture books in particular, we can learn more about ourselves, our culture, our history, and our present moment. So when I teach children's literature or ideas about childhood to college students, one of the first questions I ask is, who creates children's literature? It seems a simple question, but it's one that we don't often consider. So I ask you, who creates children's literature? Oh, yeah. Adults primarily, not in all cases, but for the most part, adults create children's literature. And adults bring with them all their own cultural baggage, all their own ideologies and political opinions and ideas about gender and race, all that stuff, whether consciously or unconsciously, it gets put into their work. We forget that sometimes. And the works of children's literature, be they good or bad, say more about we, as a culture and a society, think about children than the state or quality of children's literature, right? How many times do you have some kind of celebrity? I'm going to write a children's book. It's easy, right? It's just literature dumbed down for kids. But good literature is good literature, regardless of who is the audience. The other question I ask students is, what is children's literature? This is trickier than you might think, right? Is children's literature that which is written for children? Or is it the stuff that children read? And we know those two things don't always, they can overlap or not overlap. How many of you, when you were kids or preteens, read things you weren't supposed to be reading? Right? You either snuck things off your parents' shelf when they weren't looking and hid it under the bed, right? And I remember reading Stephen King when I was in 5th grade and thought I was really cool, right? I think it was Carrie. I was like, I'm an adult. We think it's like a because it's not for us. It's more alluring, right? Anyone in particular have a memory of a book they read they weren't supposed to read? Yeah. At 11, wow. And I think we've all done that. Like, we've been exposed to things we weren't supposed to eat, and whether it be children's literature or even movies, right? Adult movies that are rated R that we want to watch when we're 9. These worlds are always colliding. We hold contradictory idea of children in children's culture. We idealize childhood and all that's associated with it. It's carefree. It's easy, right? What do you guys think of when you think of childhood? What comes into your head? Play. I'm having a good jar ready for it. Play. I was looking for that word. Innocence. Mm-hmm. Curiosity. also devalue childhood. Children's literature or culture can't be good or valuable or smart because it's for children, right? In one of the crucial contributions to the study of children's literature, Kitty Lit, The Cultural Construction of Children's Literature in America, scholar Beverly Leon Clark says, "We tend to assume that what it means to be a child, what it means to be an adult, to understand a child, never mind what it means to write from a child's perspective, is unproblematic." The idea that childhood and its literature are unproblematic not only flattens its complexity and richness, it risks oppression and dehumanization. We see children as other. But ideas on childhood and youth affect us all, and not only because we have all been children and may be raising children of our own. The ways in which we construct, legislate, and police the ideas of child and adult ultimately determine the manner in which we believe individuals should exist in the world. We're now in this age where we explore humanity in all different, or from all different kind of angles, right? We are unpacking what, gender, race, class. But we rarely want to look at the ideas of age, right? This is what it is to be a child, and this is what it is to be an adult, and they're just, that's just the way things are. That's either because they're biological or fixed. But let's start questioning that, right? I think that's an area worthy of exploration. Ideas on childhood and youth affect us all. And youth has long been associated with innocence. That was that key word I was looking for. An idea both reflected and permeated by literature. But the idea is just that, an idea, an idealization of what the youth experience is for all actual young people, and one often, but not always, crafted by adults whose youth is now at a distance. From the 17th century through most of the 20th century, much of children's literature, film, and TV, ideas and art, usually but not always, created by adults, projected and helped shape a notion that youth is a time for innocence, a time unencumbered by the harsher truths of adulthood. Again, this idea of innocence. Now let's think. I'm sure most of you can remember back to when you were a kid and you viciously fought with your brother and sister. Or you learned curse words and said them with your friends when your parents weren't looking. Or you snuck out at night. All these things that aren't considered innocent. As adults, we may think about it, and we have our nostalgic glasses on, be like, oh, it was so much easier then. But when you were in the middle of it, there are parts of childhood that were terrifying. When you were not an innocent, you were a word I probably shouldn't say in public, right? I mean, you were complex. But for some reason, when as adults we look back on it, we like to revise a little bit, right? I can remember when I was growing up, I would get in these horrible fights with my older sister, like vicious fights, and we would scream, and it was not very innocent, I can tell you. But why are childhood and youth so closely connected to innocence? This association has become so entrenched in Western society that many people take it for a fact as opposed to cultural ideology. Ideology, it's important to remember, governs how individuals and cultures accept and filter knowledge in order to make workable realities. However, a space or gap generally forms between ideology and actuality. And multiple discourses, and when I say discourse, I mean the kind of formalized thought and language surrounding a theory or a discipline. Multiple discourses can exist at the same time. In terms of understanding the ideology of childhood, this means that a society's beliefs on childhood may greatly differ from the reality of childhood. Right? What we say childhood is often far removed from what it is in reality. And just bringing contemporary culture, We have an idea of childhood as a space for innocence and play. Look at the headlines. What do we see happening to children all the time? Whether it be at the border in detainment camps or children living in poverty, children being hungry. There are all kinds of realities for children that aren't innocent. Looking back to the history of childhood, we find drastically different beliefs regarding the young. And the notion of young innocence is not a constant or even foundational tenet. With the initial publication of his Centuries of Childhood, French historian Philippe Aurier created quite a controversy with his statement. This was his statement, quote, "In medieval society, the idea of childhood did not exist, therefore nullifying our ideas of natural childhood or childhood innocence. Those scholars have presented valid concerns about Aurier's evidential support." He based a lot of his evidence on artwork and other depictions, and we know sometimes that art isn't always an exact replica of what's happening, so scholars have questioned whether his evidence is 100% reliable. But his work undoubtedly helped spur academic scholarship on youth and childhood in multiple disciplines. We'll come to that in a second. I don't want to distract you. Children's literature scholar Maira Kalman writes that the relationship between innocence and the young is relatively recent, speaking in historical terms. Kalman explains that prior to and during the 19th century, many people subscribed to the Doctrine of Original Sin, right? We know that one, which held that human beings are born already tainted by depravity inherited by Adam. Here's a fun fact. You can tell this people at a party when you need discussion. So back in the day when we were highly Puritan here in the States, what do you do when you're a baby? When you're learning how to walk, but you have that crawling stage, right? Well, they used to make these stools, and they would trap the child because they thought that they were being demonic when they were walking on the ground, and they didn't do this. So they had these cages basically for these demonic babies. Because they're spawn of the devil, right? So here, this is better. Sorry. So prior to and during the 19th century, many people subscribed to this idea of original sin. In this ideology, the child was naturally sinful rather than naturally innocent. Historian Stephen Mintz underscores that the fallacy of belief in a natural state of childhood, asserting that childhood is not an unchanging biological stage of life, but is rather a social and cultural construct that has radically changed over time. Indeed, most of the ways in which Western cultures define or discern youth has been in flux over the centuries. One unchanging idea about youth is that our cultural conception of it is always changing. The inherent innocence ascribed to children in recent generations must not only be questioned, but also examined in terms of the harm such assumptions make. How are children marginalized or demeaned when they don't believe or do not fit into the innocence model? The innocence model of childhood gained widespread cultural prominence in the 19th century during the Romantic era. When I say Romantic era, I mean romantic big R, this is not romantic little r, like Fabio cover books, right? Not that kind of romance. But the Romantic era, it's a period that comes in response to the Enlightenment, and it stresses the power of the imagination. This time period follows the historic global impact of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, in addition to developing as a social response to the science-driven, reason-focused Enlightenment. The Romantic era emphasized the imagination as seen in the works of English poets William Wordsworth, Samuel Coleridge, and William Blake. The lasting influence of the romantic vision of childhood can be seen in Wordsworth's Ode on Imitations of Immortality from Recollection of an Early Childhood. That's a name, isn't it? It doesn't slide off the tongue that easily. But just to look at a few different stanzas from that poem, there was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light. the glory and the freshness of a dream. Behold the child of his newborn blisses, a 6 years darling of a pygmy size. See where mid-work of his own hand he lies, fretted by sallies of his mother's kisses, with light upon him his father's eyes. So during this, and this is the early 1800s, you have this idealization of the child, this romantic vision of a free space in which the child can grow and learn and play. And we also, view back on childhood as this uncomplicated time. And of course, to be uncomplicated in a free time if you are a person who didn't require to be sent out to labor or were enslaved somehow. Right? This is there is a narrow group of people who are able to fit into this category. The Romantics themselves develop alternate models of childhood innocence, with some subscribing to the theories inspired by 17th century philosopher John Locke, asserting that the minds of children are blank slates, and children must be molded by adults and imprinted with culture. We can still see how this is playing into our own ideas of childhood and growth, right? We have this significant period, basically kindergarten to age 18, which we bracket off as our blank slate periods in which we are accumulating knowledge on that blank slate, right? This is still a fundamental part of how we understand the youth development process. There's also the romantic vision that children come into the world innocent and joyous, and experience on earth stains them. So William Blake explores this conceit in his illuminated book of poetry, Songs of Innocence and of Experience, which contrasts the privileged, sheltered child, more likely to have a space to be innocent and lighthearted, with the child born into poverty and forced into, and therefore tainted by, premature experience. Blake's illuminated text, and yes, it is called, it's called illuminated text, kind of, maybe the beginnings of the picture book, but for those of you familiar with William Blake, you probably don't associate him with picture books in childhood, right? But perhaps his work is the prototype of the later picture book. And these were actually were not mass printed back in the 1700s. There are very few of them, and one person who owned original copies of some of Blake's works was Maurice Sendak. So a fan of Blake and his illumination here. But Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience is it's typographical in nature, meaning kind of like the Bible, you have the Old Testament and it's mirrored by the New Testament. That is Innocence and Experience. So every poem in Innocence has a coordinating poem in Experience. And you can see the contrast between what we think of innocence and experience. And so you have one poem in Innocence called The Lamb, and with the lamb, it has that tender voice making the veils rejoice. And it's contrasted by the tiger, right? I think maybe some of you can remember from 7th grade what the tiger is like, right? He's the tiger burning bright with his fearful symmetry. That's mirroring our experience of the lamb in Innocence. Now, over in America at this time, young people played a pivotal role in the early days of American settlement, certainly countering ideas of innocence, though they remained largely without voice or power. The abuse and cruelty endured by African youth during the development of the slave trade cannot be overlooked, as well as those difficulties also suffered by young enslaved white migrants. In the late 19th and early 20th American culture, class and race were key determinants of the construction of youth. Before laws were passed regulating child labor and compulsory education, many children and young people were forced to work because of their family's economic circumstances in both urban and rural areas. Just one example, you have your bootblacks that were working in major cities, and newsboys, and a few newsgirls, but usually it was just newsboys. The girls usually worked in factories, sewing factories. And certainly for much of the 19th century, and arguably still today, African American children could never experience the privilege of innocence because of slavery and its subsequent systematic cultural discrimination. Also, think of the cruelties that Native Americans faced, often forced to Indian boarding schools, which sought to kill the Indian to save the child. And apparently, such a child had to conform to certain cultural beliefs and practices in order to be legitimate. Also important to remember, the very real history of working children invalidates the conceit of youth as a natural, imaginative space of innocence. Or rather, it reveals the ways in which this now ubiquitous notion of childhood derives from a white middle to upper class position. What we think of childhood now comes from a very narrow perspective, but we map it on and consider it normal, even if a lot of people aren't growing up in those realities. In the Gilded Age or Progressive Era, which is the late 1800s and early 1900s, working children could not be ignored. And arguably the jarring intersection between idealized childhood innocence and working children brought about social reform in the United States. Paula Fass says that between 1880 and 1920, the increasing emphasis on child welfare and its relationship to social stability and national prosperity forced the states to think about how to regulate youth labor and education. Eventually, school attendance rose from 7 million in 1870 to 20 million in 1915. So it's because of these laws, this reform, that we start to get regulated school. And with regulated school, you need material for that. And so you get texts that are geared towards children. So during this time in the 19th century, that we see children's literature come into its own. Because of the significant cultural, social, and technological changes that are brought about starting, after the Civil War. American children's literature proliferated in the late 19th century and introduced more narratives that explored imaginative pursuits instead of, or in addition to, emphatic, moral, or didactic objectives. So for so long, all children's literature was biblical, right? Your Sunday school verses, and primers, educational materials. And it's starting in 1860. Well, scholars generally mark in 1865 as the beginning of the golden age of children's literature. So 1865 is the publication of Alice in Wonderland. And here we have a focus on the imagination. This is just a space for play and fun. It's not just, learning letters or how not to go to hell, right? And in this golden age, it's generally thought to be between 1865 and 1913, which is the 1913, 1914 are the beginning of World War I. Some scholars, if you ever get into a battle with a scholar, they may say, no, it's 1921, because that's the publication of Winnie the Pooh. So different scholars have different ideas. Scholars even debate about what children's literature is still. So, even people who study this don't know exactly what children's literature is. During this period, the ability to reproduce photographs and the mass production of color images led to a lavishly produced and illustrated books for children that helped make best-selling authors of Robert Louis Stevenson, Rudyard Kipling, Mark Twain, Frances Hodgson Burnett, E. Nesbit, Beatrix Potter, Louisa May Alcott, and A. Milne, among many others, according to Jack Zipes. Novels such as Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer appealed to both children and adults and were reviewed by leading literary critics in magazines with wide circulation. These books were read by everybody, right? They were like Modern Family or whatever sitcom that you watched with everyone. It wasn't, oh, that's for children, so us adults can't, we don't want to engage in that. No, everybody read these titles. American children's literature became more ambitious in scope and theme, in addition to reaching a wide audience of assorted readers. And in doing so, it helped fashion American culture's ideas about children and childhood. Over the course of the 20th century, I'll show you some pictures. Here is the lamb, and here's the tiger. This is when printing press has obviously become more sophisticated and you can have things in color. You get more ambitious children's literature titles. And this is an image from the Grumman Children's Literature Collection in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where I did my graduate work. And it has the largest collection of children's literature in North America. So if you're ever around Hattiesburg, visit. And this is one example of their illustration from children's literature in 1880. And slowly but surely, this is jumping ahead, but we get into things like Where the Wild Things Are and Her in the Purple Crown. We'll get there, though. So over the course of the 20th century into today, children's books and culture have flourished, and the picture book has played a huge part in this for better and for worse. So you all named some of your favorite titles earlier. We said Where the Wild Things Are. I like to teach Harold and the Purple Crown. Do you guys know that one? Did anyone see the show at the Puppetry Arts Center? No? It was really, really cool. They adapted this using this really cool technique called Pepper's Ghost, where Harold's crown kind of came to life on the stage. Very neat. We said Madeline, if you give him a mouse a cookie. These are all great titles, and they have helped shape how we understand children and their culture. And for better, these situations have helped create children's culture for better. When children's lives and abilities and imaginations are treated with the same respect we reserve for all other forms of literature. And for worse, when authors underscore their works with condescension. Right? Either they are condescending in treating children as beings with little intellect, or just dumbing material down and not relating to children as they are humans too. I was recently working on a conference paper for a conference I attend annually, the Children's Literature Association Conference, which I have so much fun at, and I go every year. I've been doing research at the Center for Puppetry Arts down in their archives. It's really cool to do research at the Center for Puppetry Arts. And you can make friends with the library archivist. Always make friends with librarians. If you take nothing with you, that's my advice. But I made good friends with the archivist there, and she's like, "Do you wanna see the stuff in the back?" Because I had just been doing stuff in the front room, and I was like, "Yeah, take me." And so I got to go back and see, these are spare Berts and Ernies and hair and sequins, all the stuff that belonged to puppets. Anyway, so I was doing some research for a paper I was doing on the Dark Crystal. Yeah, when you're a children's lit scholar, you get to do papers on the Dark Crystal, which was Jim Henson's movie from 1982. So I was doing some research on that, and I was reading old reviews when the movie came out, and there was a review that was published when it came out from the film critic. I don't know if any of you guys remember this guy, Rex Reed. He's a longtime New York film critic, and he had a review in the New York Daily Post, and it said that he, quote, "seems almost obscene to spend $25 million on a movie for children, as if children don't deserve good art." Here we see that duality. We idealize children, we idealize childhood, and we demean children, and we demean childhood. So I return to my initial question. What is a picture book, and what is it for? What should it do? I used to live in Durango, Colorado, where I taught at a small liberal arts college. Because of the school size, the English department taught a wide variety of courses. We had everything from linguistics to new media classes. I was handed a class one quarter semester, and it's called semantics. Semantics? What is that? What am I going to do with that class? Semantics is like everything, right? Semantics is meaning. So I was like, what am I going to do? I soon became very excited, though, because semantics is studying how we make meaning through signs and language. Language understood in a variety of ways, including visual. Thus, I turned the course into a class all about picture books. And it was really fun. And I taught it 3 different times, and I got to bring in all these different kinds of picture books. And it was fascinating to see how students reacted to it. And it took them a little getting used to, because they came in the class and said, this is a class all about picture books. And many of them never really shook it, but most of them did, this idea of looking at it just as this object for children. And they would always look at it through this idea of the intentionality. Like, well, this is supposed to be doing this because this is for children. And I'm like, no, just look at it as an object. What is this conveying to you? But it ended up being a lot of fun. And picture book scholars, yes, there is a thing as picture book scholars, there's a thing. They talk about picture books in regard to how images and words work together to make meaning. Here, I want to emphasize the level of literacy it takes to understand a picture book, and also underline the importance of understanding the relationship between word and image. So I kind of want to do this through looking at one of Maira Kalman's books, Next Stop at Grand Central. Sorry, I'll try to talk loud. But first, before we even look at the relationship between word and image, there is a high level of proficiency and literacy that you need just to know how to read the book, right? If you're from a different planet, you might not understand that, let's see, when you have one page, generally, the next page, it's a different part of the narrative, right? So here the story ends, or this image is, and then here it begins. That seems so easy. That's something you're brought into. And even here, as young kids, you realize that I'm reading left to right, and I get to this, and I have to turn the page. So it's more complicated than we give ourselves credit for. So let's see. These are just some other titles. Here on Poe Crown, Last Up on Market Street, I recommend. It won the Caldecott and the Newbery, which is one of the only books to have done that. And Picturing Meaning was the name of my class I taught. And does anyone know what book this comes from? Snowy Day, yes. Do you know why Snowy Day is significant? Good, I'll tell you. It was the first picture book to feature an African-American protagonist. And it was published in the 1960s, so you can imagine the impact that probably had for a lot of young people who had never seen themselves depicted in picture books before. We're going to look at Maira Kalman's Next Stop, Grand Central. How many of you have been to Grand Central? Right, and isn't it a great place of activity and movement and observations? And as a kid, of course, it ignites your imagination. So, picture book scholars, like I said, they're a thing. They generally talk about picture books in regard to the relationship between words and images. And there are different levels of that relationship. The relationship can be symmetrical, meaning they say the exact same thing. In other words, it's redundant. And your picture book scholars will tell you this just means the book is illustrated. It's not a real picture book. A real picture book has to have a relationship between words and images that is either complementary or contradictory. Meaning to have real meaning, you need both. Because if it's complementary, you're getting meaning that you can't get from solely one. And then contradictory is a little bit more sophisticated, where you have the image or the words saying something different. So perhaps maybe you have a picture book that says, Paige was a perfect little angel of a child, but the image would be like me writing on the wall with a crayon. So there's a sophistication in that. And often children and adults, they pick on that immediately, and we don't give that credit, like the sophistication that takes in understanding So, these are the relationships, and again, symmetrical, that redundant notion is maybe not a real picture book. And you see this a lot, if you have like a illustrated fairy tale where, here's the princess, and it's not giving you any new information. Another interesting thing that picture books can do is they can be very meta, and they call it kind of a meta text or a paratext, in that they play with the information leading up to the story proper. So here, this comes on the pages that usually have, the publication and copyright and all that stuff. Whereas this is a little bit meta in that the book is acknowledging its own creation, right? It's kind of saying all this stuff, but it's still part of the text, which, again, is another nuanced layer. So I want to take a look. First, I want everyone to close your eyes. And I'm going to read this to you. It's not called grand for nothing. Everything about it is grand, huge, monumental. Grand staircases, polished marble floors, stupendous star-filled ceilings. Now don't look at the projected image. You just tell me what pops into your head. I'll read it one more time. So keep your eyes closed, and I want you to tell me what comes into your head. It's not called grand for nothing. Everything about it is grand, huge, monumental. Grand staircases, polished marble floors, stupendous star-filled ceilings. So what do you see in your mind's eye? A hotel? Stairways? What else? Grand ballroom? Any kind of colors? Okay, now open your eyes. This is the image that accompanies it. That's not to say what you thought were wrong, but for this story, this is the image. Now, if you just open your eyes and see the image and you don't see any words, you might have a different idea. Right? Just looking at the image, think about the narrative you might start to tell. It might be something different. But together, when we get this description and this image, we have something completely different. What new ideas do you get when you get the language, the verbal language, linguistic signs, and the visual signs? What kind of things do you see that you wouldn't get without the illustration? Wow. Well, even the physical language too. We have no indication that this is a place of transportation, a terminal. Yeah, exactly. But we only get that through this image. So if I'm an alien and I'm coming down and I'm reading this, I might not understand that what is this? Right? What are these things? Where are they moving? Where are they going? But because we're keyed into culture, we know that one is you might know the Grand Central and all that's associated with that word or that term. But we can recognize, this is where we get tickets. Oh, here. What about this couple here? They're greeting each other maybe after a long trip, and they're seeing each other and they're reunited. We have a child here that's either lost or doesn't want to go see grandma or something, and they're crying. We have another couple reuniting. Anything else you guys see? Well, I love Maira Kalman myself. But so many of these conclusions we draw are because they're culturally ingrained, and children pick up on them. But this is also really cool, and I couldn't really capture it with a small picture. That's why I brought the book. as readers, you understand that this is one picture that goes together. Right? This is the cross, it's this. But you also understand, if you turn the page, and one page is its own scene, and this is a new scene. How do you know that? Right? I don't know. It's used to it. But that's a learned skill. So here, again, this is the other part of the big grand central theme. And we also understand another point of literacy that you've absorbed, and as a child you readily see. We know that staircase, we understand the depth. And that this is back. Right? You know that it's not right next to this lady with the furry blue thing, right? Here's another page, and I want to do the same thing. What do we get if we just look at the text? Yeah. It's 5:30 a.m. while you are dreaming about a giant one-eyed squid. Lenny Maglione is at his desk. He is in charge of the building. He has 316 people working to make sure that the building doesn't fall down. He can see everything from his window onto the main concourse. So that's the text you get. If you get that, what comes into your head? Don't get the, without the picture, what do you know? And then just think about if you only had the picture of this guy. What new meanings then do we get when we marry those two things together? Oh yeah, you're right. It's 5:30 a.m. So we wouldn't know that. Yeah, good. What kind of guy do you think Lenny is? Yeah. And he has his coffee, right? In his office seems to be, I don't know, kind of stay alert. And we can take that in a couple different ways. We can kind of say, it's 5:30, stay alert, Lenny, wake up. Or is he like hypervigilant and stay alert? So you can read it in different ways. There's also, there's not a whole lot of pictures. You have the bright yellow, which comes right. But his main focus is going to be on that concourse. And here we get another scene of activity. And this is a fascinating arrangement in terms of the people. It's kind of all over the place. Where do you go first? And there isn't a right or wrong. We kind of fall into patterns, but this kind of chaos replicates the chaos and thrill of Grand Central. Right? We have Ethan delivers the mail, and the letter to Mr. Pickle cannot go to Mr. Snickle. Ed changes one of the gazillion light bulbs standing on a very tall scissor lift. If you have a complaint, too hot, too cold, too silly, you complain to Wanda. She hears 100 complaints a week. Can you hear that many complaints and always be polite? She is. And the thing I love about Kalman's work is that they are this kind of reflections on observations and the spectacle of life, and especially as kids, that's how we come into we encounter the world, right? Because often we don't know what things are, but we're always observing, and you see that a lot in her work. And she said in an interview once that there's never a lack of things to look at, which is kind of a great thing, because when we think about childhood, maybe why as adults we're so nostalgic for childhood is that everything was so new, right? Every day you're learning something new, and by the time you're an adult, you think things are old, or you've done, you're used to them, more familiar. Whereas kids are always looking at new things. And so if we can always find ways to look at the new, maybe then we can always engage with that child within us. Kalman's work values the creativity, intellect, and curiosity of its readers. It values the whimsical, that which appeals to all of us, but just so happens to resonate in particular with children. In a June interview with WABE, Kalman said, "The nice thing about painting and writing for children is that you can be very smart or very stupid, very silly, very madcap, very heartfelt. And that's really a story you tell to any age. So I don't target an age at all, and I really don't like to think of it as if I'm writing a book for a child. It's really more that I'm telling you my story, and I hope that if you're 5 or 10 or 50 or 90, that you'll find it funny and we'll make a connection." Kalman's work challenges the idea of childhood by bringing simple or she challenges the idea of childhood being simple or unproblematic and embraces the plurality of childhood experience. Kalman's work focuses on observation in her explorations of New York City and in her egalitarian approach to the power dynamics between childhood and adulthood. I'm reminded of another work of children's literature that I quite like, Harriet the Spy. Harriet the Spy and Maira Kalman's work suggest that young people possess particular strength in engaging with and acting on the desire for knowledge. As such, they also suggest that adults can grow irrelevant if they lose their grip of curiosity. Like Harriet the Spy, Kalman's picture books equate curiosity and creativity with meaningful, active living and associate the loss of curiosity and creativity with passive resignation. Children who maintain their curiosity and expression throughout life become people who love their work. That's a quote from Harriet. And therefore love life, while adults who don't do anything and don't do anything and not doing anything, they become dull. Harriet tells us, and indeed Harriet sees no end to her investigation into life, and she invites us to reassess how we understand the boundaries of child and adult in contemporary American culture, just as Kalman's work to do. What is too old to have fun? Harriet the Spy wonders, before deciding, you can't be too old to spy, except if you are 50, and maybe you might fall off a fire escape, but you could spy around the ground a lot. In other words, age does not, or should not, deter the unending mission to know everything. I want to end this part of the talk with the words of one of the great writer-illustrators, Maurice Sendak. Back in 2013, he died not long after. He did a segment with Stephen Colbert back when Colbert was doing the Colbert Report. In Colbert, in his fictitious role of ultra-conservative political talk show host, he asked Maurice Sendak, "Why write for children?" And without missing a beat, Sendak replies, "I don't write for children. I write." And somebody says, "That's for children." So, thank you. And now we have lots of time for questions. Yeah. Dr. Seuss is, I said I could only pick a handful, but Dr. Seuss is great. And Dr. Seuss, Theodore Gesell actually started his illustrating career at the Dartmouth newspaper, and he had a lot of political cartoons. And there have been some recent publications. I'm thinking of one by the scholar Philip Nell. He talks about the racial politics of the Cat in the Hat. And if you look at some of the drawings of Dr. Seuss, you can see some roots of minstrelsy. And Gesell himself did some political cartoons that were particularly offensive to Asian Americans, but he, in his later career, said that he was regretful of those drawings. But yeah, and also too, we see Seuss later in, not separating the worlds of child and adulthood in the political ideas put forth in a book like the Butter Battle book. Anyone familiar with that? It's all about nuclear war. So, Dr. Seuss, great one. I'm particular, I like Green Eggs and Ham. Actually, because that's the book I learned to read on, so I really like it. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I thought you had a question.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
What is your favorite picture book, and why?
That's hard. It kind of depends on what I'm doing. If it's like thinking about the kind of picture book I like to teach and talk about with people versus the ones I have a connection to because it's one I loved as a kid. Like I said, I like Green Eggs and Ham because that's what I learned to read on. I have a very distinct memory of, as a kid, summer vacation in the back seat of the parents' car going to Myrtle Beach from Indiana and trying to learn to read Green Eggs and Ham. So that's what I did. But in terms of teaching, I really like teaching Harold and the Purple Crayon because it kind of is this symbolic rendering of the idea that we create our own realities, right? Harold is literally creating his own reality, so that's really fun. But in terms of new contemporary books, I love something like The Last Stop on Market Street, which is all about the wonderful diversity to be had on a bus and that experience. And there's all kinds of different realities depicted. So I really recommend that book. I also have recently discovered, thanks to a colleague, a book called Arlene the Sardine. And it's about the process of canned sardines. And so it's very perverse in that it talks about sardines getting killed and canned. And the writer, I guess, wrote it because he was trying to get out of a contract with his illustrator. And he thought it wouldn't possibly get published. And then they published it. So if you have a weird sense of humor like myself, you might seek out Arlene the Sardine. But I get, there's new great titles all the time, but I really love a picture book that, again, speaks to children as equals and doesn't condescend towards them. Yeah? And I'm sure you've seen a lot of bad ones, and there's also some really good ones, too. Amazing ones.
But when it comes to Maira Kalman, because I have some of her books that she wrote for adults and for kids, I really find that it's her own personality coming out. She's not particularly writing for kids.
Exactly.
And I don't see that with any other author, at least that I've come to know. Like, I will look at her books as if it's written for me, but that's not true for other.
Right. I mean,
so would you consider that successful or a different
oh,
genre?
I say that's completely successful. Again, it's kind of, to go back to the Sendak quote, and I mean, Kalman says this more or less too, that you're putting your ideas out there, and maybe the ideas you're putting out there are particularly of interest to a child because they're dealing with things that are whimsical or creative, but they're for everybody. Just, like a good book or a good film, or it's just good, but maybe it's specifically pertinent to this time of life. But, like a good sports movie. If it's a really good sports movie, everybody's going to like it. Right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. There can be. But I think both work because they feel honest. And I think that's the idea of honesty and truthfulness is that I think as adults we can read something, and if it's like condescending towards kids or kind of made like dumbed down, we know as adults like, this isn't very good, because it feels there's a false layer to it. I think so. For me, I'm looking for that kind of just emotional truths.
We've got time for one final question.
Come on, somebody has to have one. No? No, it's not okay. You can't. You reached your limit. No, I'm just joking.
Whether it's an illustration or a
Oh,
story?
that's a good question. I don't, but I think you made a good a comment that I didn't really touch on is when I was talking about the relationship between words and images and the idea of contradictory or complementary relationships. In terms of successful picture books, I find the best ones are when your author illustrator is one person, or that they're working in collaboration with each other. Often, and this isn't, they're not always not successful, but a lot of times you just have matchmaker situations with a publisher, right? They'll pair together the writer with, we have this upcoming artist, and they pair them together, and they don't ever meet. And those can work, but I think even more successful is when the two people generally know each other. So like Last Up on Market Street, you have Christian Robinson and Matt de la Pena, and they work together. And I think that ends up working well together. You get a lot of husband-wife partnerships. I'm thinking of Crockett Johnson, who did Harold and the Purple Crayon, worked with his wife on other books. But I think that collaboration. But I don't know of any specific where the children and an adult work. I'm sure there are some. That's a good research project, actually. But is there any recommendations someone has for a great picture book? Oh. Say that name again. Audrey and Don Wood. Oh, okay. Yeah. Any others? I mean, there's so many good ones. But I think that's all we have time for. But I hope if you guys have time, go walk through the Kalman exhibit if you haven't seen it already. And just thank you for coming out. Read more picture books. Oh, good. I was worried it was like 7:30, and I was like, oh, goodness. Oh, good.